to wriggle while I find my little pointer, and then we'll get started. So you've got a second.
Great. I'll grab this. Great.
How do this turn off?
Now I'm just going to check with you, Tim. What time do we need to finish here? 2, 3 o'clock. Cool. Great. All right, well, let's wrap up where we got to before our lunch, and then we hit the kind of home stretch on this material. So what we were trying to do is think together about our situation, to do that work of situational awareness, and we're trying to put forward the argument that we live in a secular age, that we're in a moment of secularisation. That's the way the traffic is going. But we also wanted to say that the picture is complicated, that the way that's moved is not often the story that people have in their heads, and we put forward that proposition, which is from Philip Pullman, the great atheist children's author, that the world is far more influenced by once upon a time than it is by thou shalt not. And so we thought about those the stories that we tell ourselves in secularisation. And I wanted to put to you that all of the secularisation narrative that we have takes a kind of predictable form in people's minds. It goes a little something like this. I think the origin story we have is that we used to be happy and free, but there was a problem which religion came and darkened our view of the world. It restrained us morally and it inhibited us intellectually, but then science and modernity came and showed us a way beyond religion, and so here we are. This is the kind of testimony that religion's still around, but its influence is marginal, and it's on its way out. That's the kind of story that the secular thesis tells itself, that that science and religion, science and Christianity have done round after round, and science just keeps outperforming Christianity. It keeps explaining things better than the Bible can. The way Charles Taylor, I'm going to introduce you to Charles Taylor in a second, he talks about this as a kind of a subtraction story. So he says that the way people frame our secular moment is to say that, this isn't his word, but in my summary of his word, it's as if someone's got a vacuum cleaner and flicked it to religion and then sent it through our culture, and all the religion is getting mopped up and there's just less and less of it, and eventually it'll be all gone and we'll just be left with our culture minus religion. So what is the West? What is secular? It's what we always were going to be, just without the crazy stuff. That's the kind of story that secular people tell themselves, and that's the question that Charles Taylor wanted to push back on and challenge, because he thinks that's not true. That story about ourselves, that we're Western culture minus the crazy, doesn't fit with the data. That's just not how it happened. And that hidden in our stories, what we tell ourselves, is not religion told us a story and now we've got facts, but Christianity tells us a story of who we are, and secularism tells us a story of who we are, and they're both stories. And they're both doing the same thing. They're trying to enlist us into a view of the world and to a set of preconditions and moral assumptions and aesthetic values and so on. And it's not fair, says the great Charles Taylor, to allow secularism to just be the gang with the facts and religion to be the meaning, values, let's feel better about ourselves in this dark world. He says that's just not actually the case. So what Taylor does in his thinking, that whole, we said before, that not religious anymore idea, is there you find the story lurking just below the surface in that kind of thing. And so Taylor asks the question, he says this: why is it that in 1500, so you were born in 1500, why is it that in 1500, whatever the case was, it seems to be that it was easy, if not natural, to believe in God, Whereas come to 2020, and the experience of believing in God feels, for a lot of people, fragile, corrigible, and in principle doubtable. That if you are a believer in God, as I take it probably the vast majority of you are, you come here in the awareness that your way of seeing and being in the world isn't the only option on the table, and that there's a certain fragility or just a certain kind of experience that probably wasn't true of the person born in 1500. That's what Taylor's really interested in, to say what's it like to be on the inside of that. And this is my kind of... there's Charles Taylor. And this is my Taylor for Dummies. So what Taylor says is it's not to do with Darwin, even though that's, it's a relevant bit of data. But what he says is that through a long, complex process that includes ideas and includes technology, that includes a whole kind of vast, complicated view of things, we find ourselves in a situation in the modern West where we are immanently framed. That's Charles Taylor's word, which is to say that you have the transcendent, that is God, the good, the true and the beautiful, the transcendent realities. And what we've done in the West is framed them out of daily life. And the frame word is important because, if you go to a art gallery and you see a picture and it's got a frame around it, the frame isn't saying, guys, there's nothing that exists on the other side of the frame. It's just saying, look here. Concentrate on this. Don't worry about that at the moment. We're not talking about that. We're concentrating on what's inside the frame. And Taylor says that we're at a moment now in our culture where the transcendent has been framed out. You can be open to it. So you might be in that frame saying, I think there's a God beyond. And someone else says, I don't. But both of us say, but we can still catch the bus together. We can still talk about, politics and morality and so on. We can transact a whole lot of life in an immanent frame, even if the transcendent frame, there might be something beyond it. That's what Charles Taylor says about being immanently framed, which is the shaping force for how we experience being Christian and what it means for someone to become Christian in our time and our age. Let me kind of frame that a bit more personally. Taylor's really interested in how the self is constructed, how it is that we think about ourselves and what the subjective experience is of being alive and a believer or not in our age. So let me paint you this picture. Say you were born at that point, in the 1500s. What would your experience of life have been like? Here we go. You would have been born in a context where you were one of 8, maybe 10 children, several of whom would have died before their 5th birthday. You would have known with 99% accuracy what you were going to do for a job when you grew up. Because it was based on 2 immovable things, your gender and the occupation of your parents. So if you were the son of a farmer, you were going to be a farmer. If you were the daughter of a farmer's wife, you were going to be the wife of another farmer, because your gender and your circumstances dictated to you with huge accuracy a sense of where you were in the world and what you were going to do. And so if you were born then, you never had the conversation, so what are you going to do when you grow up? Because it just never came up. You knew what it was going to do. It was ascribed to you. Indeed, you only had the tiniest choice on most of the major factors that went into your life. Where you lived, what you did, and who you married were all more or less decided for you. And so at your graduation ceremony, no one gave a speech that said, guys, the main thing is that you follow your dreams. The thing is that you've got to do you. You just need to work out who you are and express it to the world. That never came up. It wasn't even on the table. Most of the wisdom that was available to you in the songs that you sung and the poems that you knew off by heart and the stories that you were told was wisdom about how to cope with things that you could not change. How to exist in a situation where nothing was going to move. They were about coping. The world you lived in was an enchanted world. There were spirits and demons and forces that buffered you and were beyond your control. So if there was a thunderstorm, think of Martin Luther, your first thought was that God was probably angry with you, that you had done something wrong. Your life was communal. You had next to no privacy, next to no time to yourself. Most of the people that you knew were the people you were going to know for the rest of your life. So you had a very thick experience of community, maybe a bit too thick, a bit stifling and overwhelming. And your life had a surplus of meaning. Or almost too many things meant something, because the failure of the crop meant something, and the thunderstorm meant something, and the orange tinge on the sunset meant something. So everything meant something, but you had very little freedom. That is, you had very little freedom of choice. All the decisions were made for you, that you were a Christian, that you were English or Irish or whatever, that you were a farmer, that you were going to marry Guinevere. They were all at the centre, were made for you. And so you experienced life as often feeling afraid, feeling vulnerable because there were forces that could come at you, but you almost never wondered about whether life had meaning, because the meaning was shaped for you. Now fast forward to the 2020 version of you. So let me paint you that picture. You'd probably be born into a family of 1, 2, maybe 3 kids. It's possible that you get to your 30s, even your 40s, and have never seen a dead body or even lost someone who's close to you. Not likely, but possible. There's the chances that you will do with your life what your parents did with their lives are very small. And if your parents are Caucasian, they'll actively discourage you from doing it. So if you're a Caucasian parent and you're meeting other Caucasian parents, I'm making allowances for team non-Anglo, but if you're Caucasian and your kids do what you do, you're slightly embarrassed. You say, well, we didn't force them. He wanted to be an engineer. She wanted to be a doctor. It wasn't pressure that was coming from us, and you'll feel like you're a bad parent if your kids did what you did. Your gender and your parents' career are far less relevant to what you did when you grow up, and a million times in your life someone said, so what are you going to do when you grow up? Your graduation speeches and so on were all about people saying, you do you follow your dreams. The most important thing is not what you do, but that you want to do it. The highest value is that you chose, that you stand behind that. You didn't follow a tradition, you didn't invest yourself into someone else's dream, you chose your own thing. And as a consequence, almost every movie, every song, every book, every poem is about following your dreams, and you've almost never read anything about coping with unchangeable circumstances. If you believe in spirits and demons, you can go days, weeks, or even a lifetime without being able to name an event in your life that was definitely caused by them. You may well have lived alone. You will have experienced loneliness. You will need privacy. Your experience of community will be thin. And you will occasionally have wondered whether anything means anything at all. But you have huge freedom. Almost unlimited, untold levels of freedom, but it's freedom of choice. The freedom to choose from a wide range of things, including things like that you are a Christian. Whether you marry, which gender you marry, which career you take on, which way you authentically present yourself to the world, which gender you assign to yourself, how you present, will all be things that you get to choose. And so what's it like to be that person? Like, you're almost never afraid. In fact, you could watch a horror movie on Friday night to relax. Unthinkable for someone born in 1500. I think we tend to watch Friday night thrillers about. Normally we watch shows about police solving dramas. I sometimes wonder whether police watch shows about pastors solving problems, because we could swap. So you're almost never afraid. You don't feel as guilty as you would have 500 years ago. but you have an extreme experience of anxiety, and you worry that nothing means anything. You're more in control of who you are, and the way you are in the world is much more to do with choices that you've made. But the flip side is that who you are now is also your fault. So you've got almost no resources for making sense of the givenness of your circumstances, for the things that have constrained you and held you back and meant that you couldn't be the person that you meant to be. And so in exchange for guilt, you have crushing anxiety and a debilitating concern about the meaninglessness of it all. And that's welcome to 2020 in Perth. That's Taylor's kind of account, or my account of Taylor's account of what it means to be framed in a secular age. He calls it our age the age of authenticity, an age where the highest value is to authentically express who you are. One of the ways you can see that is you ask the question, how do I persuade someone to do something that they might die in the process of doing? So think about that. Your task is to say to someone, come and do this thing. You could die as a result. And let me show you the obvious example of that is the, I'll flip over from that. The obvious example is the army. So in World War I, how do you persuade someone to come and be prepared to die? You say, come into the ranks and fight for king and country. Don't stay in the crowd and stare. You are wanted at the front line. Enlist today. Notice what's happened there. In both situations, they're saying, come and risk your life. In the first one, they say, come and risk your life. How am I going to get someone to do that? And you think, well, I'm going to appeal to something that's bigger than them. I'm going to appeal to something that's outside them, to something that is, in one sense of the word, transcendent. It says, hey, it's not all about you. There's a king and country, and you don't want to be standing and staring. And then fast forward to 2020, and we say, do what you love. And if you look at any army ad of the last 10 years, they're all like that. The army is a place not where you get constrained, but it's a place where even though you have to wear a uniform, you get to discover a path that is uniquely yours. That you get to find your way into a situation where you get educated, where you take on all these things. And that is what Taylor would call the age of authenticity, where the highest value is to express your inner self. Now, I've got my little summary back there, which I skipped over. This is the way of thinking what it's like in the imminent frame. Large families, now small families. Death is very present, now it's hidden. Community was tight and suffocating, now it's loose and thin. Our roles were assigned to us, now our roles are created. Our life choices were minimal and trivial, now they're massive and overwhelming. The natural world was enchanted with beauty and terror. It was scary for you and you honoured it. Now the world is disenchanted and you feel like you have to care for it. Nature has gone from being something that is a threat to something that is fragile, from something that was trying to kill you to something that you're worried that you're accidentally killing with your next plastic straw. Moral reasoning was objective. So your question wasn't what feels best, but your question was, what is this thing in front of me? What is a tree, a flower, a human, and what's its goal and end? What's its telos? Whereas now moral reasoning is subjective. We're discovering our own forness, and the most important moral category is to not stand in someone else's way. The negative emotions were fear and guilt, and now they're loneliness, anxiety and meaninglessness. So your identity was ascribed to you and now it's discovered by you. Now we're going to jump into our thinking about, actually I'm going to give you one more thing. No, I'm not. I'm going to pause and ask if you've got any questions because we're going to loop off on the secularism, secular age stuff and jump into mission and ministry in Australia. Any questions or comments on that? Yeah. Forness meaning that where you're in traditional, like classic moral reasoning, you think your main question is to think, what is this thing for? What is its nature and its end? And so you look at I'll use this example. Like you think about a fetus, a baby in a belly, and you think, what is its orientation? It's orientated toward life. Its full floweriness to be a human being. Whereas now we would think. You discover your own fullness, and the baby in the womb is a threat to the higher moral good of living a life where you chose at every point of the way who you are and the circumstances that you're in. Yep, same with refugees. We'll decide who comes and under what circumstances they come, rather than thinking who is this person and to what obligations do I owe to them. Yeah. Universally, as opposed to just in the West. So I think this is a distinctive feature of the West and those places that the West has influenced, and so you'll see these things play out differently in different cultures. So Taylor would say that you've got a long, slow build of these kind of ideas and some technology and stuff that changes things. And so the thing that we're describing there is essentially, if you know this group, is essentially how the Bloomsbury group thought. So if you know the Bloomsbury Group, which is Ian Foster and Virginia Woolf and the arts and crafts movement and Grant and those guys, there's a group in the 20s and kind of before and between the wars, and they hung around Cambridge. They followed Bertrand Russell was the kind of old guy that they looked up to. He was the sort of mentor and so on. And you go back and read them, and it feels so contemporary because they're gender fluid, kind of pansexual in the way they related to each other. They thought that the highest good was to find your inner self and then express that to the world. So Ian Foster has a very famous quote, at the time where people are getting recruited into the army to serve king and country, he says, I hope if I have to choose between my friends and my nation, I hope I have the courage to choose my friends. Which is this kind of classic kind of early thing. And I think what Taylor would say is that in the 60s, post-war, suddenly, because the disadvantage of living like the Bloomsbury group, because is that you have to be able to afford abortions and you have to be able to, it costs a lot of money to live that liberally. And then after World War II, post-war prosperity means that we can afford to live like that. And then with the pill, we can avoid one of the obvious consequences of living that way. So it really takes the post-war prosperity to make that minority point of view the kind of default moral stance of Western culture. Yeah. Cool. We're going to do one more and then we're going to jump into Australia. Cool. 100% of our questions about secularism have been solved. That's so good. Cool. So we want to think about what it means to do mission and ministry in secular Australia. We're going to start thinking about those two tribes. Here's the... I'll skip that. Here's the way that I think is the best way to understand our current situation in Australia. So what we were until very recently was notionally a Christian nation, and we've become a secular nation. I think that's the best way to frame what happened in our lifetime, that a very large, now a majority of people are comfortable with saying, nah, not Christian, just I'm a nun. And not an NUN, that would be like an extreme kind of Christian, but... when people sometimes talk about the rise of the nuns, it sounds hilarious because it sounds like a bunch of nuns are coming to attack our culture. But the rise of the NONESs, that's been the change in our culture. Now, one of the features of that change is that up until very recently, to be a born-again Christian, so to be an evangelical Christian, was to be an intensive form of the culture. So some people here are old enough to remember that the annoying thing about you was that you took too seriously a thing that everyone took a tiny bit seriously. That you were too enthusiastic about things that everyone thought probably if you were a better person you'd be a bit into. And so in 1959 Billy Graham comes and almost every sermon is about you must be born again. But the new birth's only mentioned 2.5 times in the New Testament. Every one of Billy Graham's sermons. So why is that? It's because he looks out over the MCG, and if he says, "Hey guys, you should become Christian," they're like, "Yeah, we're good. I'm Presbyterian, she's Catholic, and he's Church of England." And Billy Graham has to come back and say, "No, you must be born again." You're like, "What? I was baptised. Is that what you mean?" "No, you must be born again." "Oh, but I'm kind of a good moral person, but you must be born again." Because he's evangelising a situation where people think they're Christian and they need to know what it is to come into a personal relationship with Jesus. And the need to come into a personal relationship with Jesus hasn't changed, but the circumstances have changed. So now to be a Christian is not to be an intensive form of the culture, it's to be a alternative to the culture. And it's to be an alternative to the culture that is in some very profound sense immoral. Because it's a vision of life and flourishing and culture that denies the organising principle of secular morality, which is that you don't inhibit the choices of others, that you don't stand in the way of the authentic expression of the inner person as they seek to express that to the world. And so that's why if you feel like the temperature's changed in the last 10 or 20 years, I think that's why. Because what we represent is not an intensive form, but an alternative, and one that is a challenge to the prevailing morality, making us appear, according to that metric, actually immoral. So we need to learn to think like missionaries. That's the short form of it, to say that we're in a situation where we haven't got the wind to our backs, we haven't got a situation where the culture is forming us, and I want to think about these three tribes, these three ways of breaking down Australia into its kind of constituent parts. I know there's other ways to do this. We could think about various ethnic groups, we could think about age groups, we could think about rural and city and so on, but I want to introduce you to a way that people like Tim Foster and others think about it, which is thinking about suburban, urban and battler. Suburban culture, urban culture and battler culture, and what does it mean to hold out the word of life in a secular age into those contexts. So let's start first where most of us live, in the suburbs. So mission and ministry in the suburbs, we're going to do a little bit of group analysis. So here's a picture of Scott Morrison, who is famously wears a suburban kind of persona. So what is it about Scott Morrison that kind of exudes that suburban persona? Say again, sorry? Supports the Sharks. Yeah, that's huge. It's like he's for the Sharkies, and he wants to go there. In over east, that's the rugby league is the more sort of working class, the more the less toffee sort of code, and he's all about that. Anything? What else? Yeah. Yeah, 2 kids and had played board games to get through COVID. So he's a figure, like a family man. He's someone who pays attention to the kids. They live in the Sutherland Shire. So my wife, I'm from Perth, I'm from Albany, but my wife's from the Sutherland Shire, and I had to get a letter from the council to extract her from there. A friend of mine gave it to me. I'm not sure. He possibly just photocopied the letterhead, but it's a hard place to escape from. What else about ScoMo? Yeah, male, middle class and white. He's the one who provides for his family. White guy, he's male. ScoMo, yeah, a nickname. Yeah, so you're not calling him by a title or whatever. He's called ScoMo.
He's intellectual, but certainly he doesn't want to play that up.
Yeah, that's right. So unlike Paul Keating, so here's someone that may probably as smart as each other. No doubt Scott Morrison is an incredibly smart, huge capacity person, but he presents to the world as this like slightly pudgy kind of Sharkies and so on. Absolutely, that we're thinking together about the suburbs. Most of us live in the suburbs. They are and something like 70 or 80% of Australians are in suburban contexts. And even if you're from somewhere like Albany or Busselton, depending on which part of those cities you live in, you'll probably recognise these as the dynamics of your life. Here's an interesting thing. If you put a pin in the CBD of almost any Australian capital and then draw a circle about 10 k's out, and then another circle about 40 k's out or 30 k's out from the city, and then do a circle, all the large churches will be in that area. Doesn't matter whether it's Adelaide or Melbourne or Sydney or Perth, all the larger churches will be in that mid-band suburban centre. So why is that? Yeah, that's okay. Good. That's where people live. Anyone else want to contribute to that? Yeah, no, that's where the majority of people are. But that's where the larger churches are. So you go into those inner city areas, they won't be there. Often the battler areas won't be there. But those suburban churches, especially that kind of mid-band, is where you're going to find the Bible belts of most of our churches. Now, most of our cities. I'm going to put forward an argument. It may be to do with the fact that, to an extent, the suburbs are a Christian invention. So according to Tim Foster's argument, the suburbs, which are ridiculed by the inner cities, and we're often kind of sheepish about them, that they were an invention to some degree of the Clapham sect, the gang that hung around Wilberforce and so on, because after the Industrial Revolution, the cities, like the inner cities, became places that fostered vice. So you had rich and poor cheek and jowl together. You had situations, your kids walking past a prostitute and walking. There's this whole kind of nexus of evil and malforming practices that come at you in the city in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. And the aristocrats, so Wilberforce and his friends, were able to live out in Clapham, which is now kind of considered an inner city area, but live out in Clapham and then come into the vice-ridden city and then go back to the virtue-ridden kind of suburbs. And a huge part of their kind of their projects was to make that virtue-encouraging suburban experience available to more people, to allow people to be in a situation where there's a little bit of green and there's a little bit of distance from the city, that it's not as gritty and grimy, that you can start to, and this is a very important part of the logic of suburbs, you can begin to compartmentalise different aspects of your life. That you get to start to say, actually, I want some space between me and that, between this thing and that thing, that I want to be able to take some control of my life and to start to eke out an existence that where I'm not just the victim of my circumstances. Here's a picture, and again we'll do a little bit of cultural analysis. Here's a picture of so what do you see? What do you, if you're just doing some kind of analysis of that, what do you notice about a suburb, a classic kind of Perth suburb? I don't know which one this is though. It's a very orderly picture, isn't it? It's a picture of order. You've got everyone's got their own backyard. It makes sense when you're there, but from the sky you're like, does everyone need a pool? But you do. You've got this very orderly scenario. What else? Controlled entrance. Absolutely. So I think here you've got some sort of, that looks like a more thoroughfare, but then to come in here, the people in here are people who have chosen to be in here. You've come off the thoroughfare and you've come into a kind of somewhat guarded situation. Yeah, so this is a very striking thing that is not true of any other cityscape before the invention of the suburb, is that every house is more or less the same, reflecting the fact that in suburbs the demographic bell curve is very flat. So the difference in terms of earning income, strata in society between all these guys is almost minuscule compared to the pre-suburban industrialised city, where rich and poor and prostitute and lawyer and so on all live in close proximity to each other. It's a very striking thing. If you brought someone from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and showed them that photo, it would be unbelievable. Because every house is the same, as opposed to a huge house next to a poor house next to it, I think. What else do you notice?
There's no churches in there, no spires, no buildings.
Yeah, it is 100% residential, right? That's the only thing that's going on there, is people live in houses. There's no shops, there's no spies, there's no, everything else is a self-contained experience. Yeah. Yep, roads. So it's obviously this is a technological thing that the reason you can have a picture like that and there's only residential is because people have got cars, so they can get to places where they can get their food and so on. Yeah. Yeah, which is a huge part of its origin. So I've got a quote here from William Cowper, the poet: "God made the country and man made the town." And so there's this kind of Edenic sense that to have green and to have trees and so on is part of this kind of virtue-generating culture that the suburbs are there to foster. Let's get one more. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So there's no people. People are coming in, and the classic kind of relatively recent suburban invention is to have the car that goes into the garage, and then you have access to the house from the garage. So you don't even have that awkward 11 seconds where you might bump into a stranger from your letterbox to the thing. You just get to go straight into the house. Cool. So these are the suburbs, the logic and dynamic of the suburbs. And I want to say that the suburbs, if that's true, and I think it's to some extent true, I think maybe Tim Foster overclaimed some stuff, but it's important to reflect that the relative success of our churches in those sorts of areas probably reflects something that's profound and worth bearing in mind when we come to the battlers, because one of the challenges in battler culture is that people convert and lift. And they almost always lift into more traditional suburban areas because the gospel makes people stop drinking, stop gambling, want to raise the kids, you take a greater interest in education, and you do want to protect your kids from the domestic violence that they maybe saw and the community where they're going to get pulled back into drug use and so on. And the suburbs are purpose-built for that. So to be just kind of hostile and critical of the suburbs is really silly, but I think one of the biggest challenges for the suburbs is, you can think of lots of them, but the surprise one is envy. And here's the surprise, because in inner cities and where you're you're up against people who are very different from you, it turns out that we don't feel particularly envious of people who are fabulously more wealthy than us. So you don't think to yourself, oh man, I wish I was as wealthy as Bill Gates. Maybe some people do, but basically you think it's just so ludicrously orders of magnitude more wealthy that you don't lose any sleep over it. But when your next door neighbour has a slightly better car than you, it's kind of annoying. When they've got a slightly better barbecue, when you find out that there's another pastor or gospel worker that gets paid like $6,000 more than you per annum, that's annoying. Gore Vidal says that, Gore Vidal, the American writer, that every time a friend of mine succeeds, a little part of me dies. And the suburbs are kind of purpose-built for envy. Because everyone's a competitor. Everyone is someone who is potentially a challenge to you and your ability to succeed and so on. And so envy is one of the great challenges of the suburbs. Clive Hamilton talks about the way barbecues are advertised. So there's a famous barbecue campaign where I can't remember, it's called the Turbo whatever, blah, blah, blah. It's got infrared and it can kind of, blast and bake and cook and broil, and whoever knows what broiling is. And but then the campaign underneath it says, I love the look on my neighbour's face when I roll out my turbo. So you're not even saying this is good, but this is good because it defeated them. Because they're my proximate competitor. One of the challenges of the suburbs as well is that the gospel that people are raised in is often not our gospel. A group of sociologists, a guy called Christian Smith, who I think is actually not a Christian, but his name happens to be Christian, Christian Smith, did some work in the American suburbs, especially in some of the mega churches, and tried to ask, at first they wanted to know what Christianity was like for the next generation. That's an interesting question, right? Though, what's Christianity like for the generation that are coming up? And then, as they started to investigate it, as sociologists, he was like, this might not be Christianity. 'Cause I'm not hearing a lot of Trinity. I'm not hearing a lot of Father sent his Son to die for our sins, and that the greatest thing is to deny yourself and take up the cross and follow him. And so they had to go back to their research, and instead of saying this is what Christianity is like, they say, what is this religion? And they came up with the name moralistic therapeutic deism, which is a religion that looks a little bit like this. Well, God exists, who created order and the world and watches over human life on earth. God wants people to be good, nice and fair to each other, as taught in the Bible and by most world religions. The central goal of life is to be happy and to feel good about yourself. God doesn't need to be particularly involved in someone's life except when there's a problem to be resolved. And good people go to heaven when they die. And this is Christian Smith and his team went into churches that would say the Apostles' Creed, that believe what we believe, and yet this is what the average member carried in their heart and mind. And part of the thesis, at least, is this is the gospel that suburban life aids and abets. And the great challenge is to be able to preach a gospel that cuts through from that. Just very quickly, in the last 4 minutes that we have, suburban churches are great. They're the powerhouse of much contemporary ministry. They're places that can grow and they can grow large. Part of how they grow large is that in suburban churches, people understand scale because that's the kind of trade-off in the suburbs, that in exchange for being in a whole area where there's no shop, you can drive to a supermarket and you get everything there. And people think similarly about churches, that everyone wants to be at a church of about 70 people. But in the suburbs, you know that I can go to a church of 600 and there is a youth program that I couldn't possibly get anywhere else. And there's preaching that I couldn't get in this thing. And people understand instinctively in suburbs the power of scale. People say that in suburbs you should think of your parish as the 20 minutes that people are prepared to travel to come to your church. Which means we all live in huge parishes now if you live in the suburbs, because we live in this area where people are prepared to do that kind of distance, and in a kind of freaky way, people, when they live outside that distance, that's where you've got an opportunity to plant a church, because people, but that 20 minutes means that our church has got access to, I think, 800,000 people, because they're people that live 20 minutes from where we are. One of the great tricks one of the great things to do in suburban ministry is to understand the logic that, because it's that compartmentalised life, you can talk about faith over food and in homes in a way that you can't at work. Because work is a place where if you go to work and say, look guys, we've got to get this report done by 2 o'clock, would anyone mind if I sang and just prayed for us now and asked the Lord Jesus to come and help us? It just feels, this is wrong. But if you go to someone's home on a Saturday night and you say, and you're eating a meal together and you say, what matters most to you? And then you say, what matters most to me is Jesus. In suburban logic, that makes sense. But then that's the risk. Because we put Jesus where he fits, and then the threat is we don't realise that he's claiming it all. I'll end with this. Leslie Newbigin, the great missionary, he spends 4 decades in India. He's doing work in India where he's sharing the gospel with Hindus, and he used to go to the temple each week and he would read the New Testament, they would read their scriptures and they would exchange views. And Leslie Newbigin looks up and he can see that there's a picture of Jesus. And he asks them about it. He says, on the 25th, they say, on the 25th of December each year, we worship Jesus. We offer him some oranges and incense, and we honour one of the sons of God for the enlightenment that he brought to the world. And Leslie Newbigin says, is that the first step toward the conversion of India? And the answer, of course, is no. That's the first step toward the Indian conversion of Christianity. because Jesus has been taken and put in a box where the Hindu worldview stays in place. And I think that is the great risk in especially suburban ministry. That we, as we separate facts from values, as we separate public from private, we inadvertently put Jesus in a box, in a position, in a place where he doesn't claim our lives in the way that the gospel says he does. Urban and battlers tomorrow. I'll pray. Father, we thank you so much for the opportunity that so many of us have to minister and work in the suburbs. We thank you for the peace that they bring, for the Christian heritage and concern for the cultivation of virtue, and we also name and acknowledge the challenges of the way the suburbs can form us to be less than the disciples of Jesus that you call us to be, and to preach a smaller Jesus than the one that you have given to us. So, Father, I pray for people working in suburban contexts that we would hold out the word of life in a way that is faithful and life-giving and true, so that people would come to faith and salvation in him. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.